Welcome to Race, Technology, and Healing. Science is Not Enough to Save Us Spring Conference. We are glad that you could join us today. Garrett-Evangelical Theological Seminary has been awarded a Science for Seminaries seed grant from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program. Michael, if you can switch to slide 2, please. The grant has helped fund the Race, Technology, and Healing, Science, and Religion in Dialogue, project led by yours truly, Rolf Nolasco, Rueben P. Job, Professor of Spiritual Formation and Pastoral Theology, and Director of the Rueben P. Job for Spiritual Formation, and Dr. Wonhee Anjo, Harry R. Kendall, Professor of Christian Theology and Postcolonial Studies. The American Association for the Advancement of Science is the world's largest general scientific society and publisher of the science family of journals. AAAS was founded in 1848 and includes 261 affiliated societies and academies of science, serving millions of individuals. The nonprofit is open to all and fulfill its mission to advance science and serve society to initiatives in science policy, international programs, science education, public engagement, and more. Building upon its mission, AAA established the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion program in 1995 to facilitate communication between scientific and religious communities. Through this seed grant, we have been able to create and curate an opportunity for the Garrett community to engage in exploring scientific, sociocultural, psychological, and theological ways to understand a mutual and flourishing notion of the human with forms of relationality that brings about mutual healing. We are very pleased to have Dr. Philip Kurian to be our keynote speaker today. Dr. Philip Kurian is a theoretical physicist, researching scientist and essayist, serving as principal investigator and founding director of the Quantum Biology Laboratory at Howard University and visiting research professor at the University of Iowa. Beginning his career as a math teacher in North Philadelphia, Dr. Kurian is now the recipient of fellowships, grants, and awards from the U.S.-Italy Fulbright Commission, Argonne and Oak Ridge Leadership Computing Facilities, Whole Genome Science Foundation, National Science Foundation, and the National Institutes of Health. After Dr. Kurian's lecture, Dr. Wonhee Anjo, Harry R. Kendall Professor of Christian Theology and Postcolonial Studies and Director of PhD Studies at Garrett will offer a response. Dr. Jo is also a faculty affiliate in the Departments of Religious Studies and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University and member of the research faculty cohort on religion, race, and global politics of the Buffett Institute for Global Studies at Northwestern University. She also serves as faculty advisor for Pan-Autumn, an Asian Summer Theological Institute, member of the Executive Board for Political Theology Network, and advisory board for Lexington Press Series on postcolonial and decolonial studies in theology. In addition to numerous articles and chapters, her publications include Heart of the Cross, a postcolonial Christology, and co-editor of Critical Theology Against U.S. Militarism in Asia, Decolonization and Deimperialization and Feminist Praxis Against U.S. Militarism. Forthcoming from Fordham University Press is Trauma, Affect, and Race. Welcome, Dr. Kurian and Dr. Jo. Dr. Kurian, the space is now yours.
Thank you so much, Rolf. I was really touched by the president's words and also just want to reiterate what he said about thanking Rolf for his dedication in, applying with Anne for this grant and for then continuing to reach out. It's been wonderful. And then just to see the PhD students today, it's a perfect tee up to the conversation today. And thank you all who are joining today. That I hope that in presenting what I'm going to do today, it won't be a traditional scientific lecture. And in that way, it will be more of a sketch. And so as it's a sketch, I hope that you will participate, in asking questions in the comments, participating when we have time at the end to engage. And so in engaging, we will relate. And for this moment that you've made to connect and to make space in your day for this, I hope we can have a beautiful conversation. So in the spirit of a sketch, thanking Rolf for that very kind introduction, I'll say that rather than offering unduly precise definitions within some sort of strictly reductionist approach, the nature of the things that I'm going to talk about today, considered at the boundaries between our first person subjective experiential realities and an objective third person material reality, will make clear the necessity of an integrative, a philosophical, a humanistic, and even a spiritual framework in order to adequately identify, treat, and address these problems. So let's start very simply. Consider a tree. What do you notice? What do you observe? The answers to these questions, of course, are contingent upon many factors, including the time of year, the type of tree, and the measuring tool of the observer. If you have no special equipment, you're probably going to resort to some subset of your five senses to experience the tree, the roughness of its bark, the softening of its leaves in the wind, the rich colors and bright interplay of light and life in its branches, the cool shade it offers, the fruit it bears, the hardness of the seeds within that fruit, the partial exposure and hiddenness of its roots. And maybe if you are curious, all this noticing and observing will lead you to question the limits of your senses to fully experience the tree. Then the scientific question arises. What tools could help us observe the roots or the branches, the leaves or the fruit, the seeds and their constituents with greater resolution? Other questions may soon follow close behind. How do the leaves, roots, and other parts work together to form the fruit? How does a tree know when to produce fruit and when, for example, to shed leaves? Why are some trees different? Do trees communicate? And if so, how? If the observer is particularly introspective, they may wonder whether we can learn more about ourselves by considering the wisdom contained in the construction of the tree. In particular, what remains hidden to our perception? Can we participate in the creation of other trees? How do these stationary but majestic giants endure in often harsh conditions over hundreds of years? What do they experience in isolation and in community? What are their purposes for existing? Will our advanced tools for observing trees help us to better understand their treeness? And can we benefit more from trees as a result of our observations? Will we? The foundational question: what lies behind the appearances? A similar question was asked by Owen Barfield, the wisest and best of C.S. Lewis's unofficial teachers. Barfield begins his book, Saving the Appearances, by considering a rainbow. Unlike the tree, the rainbow seems further from our direct apperception in that it cannot be touched, smelled, tasted, or heard. The rainbow in particular is a physical phenomenon that is uniquely perceived only by observers outfitted with eyes that are tuned to be sensitive to the visible spectrum of light. If an observer were only to see in the ultraviolet spectrum, as some insects do, the rainbow, as it were, would not be depictable as shown here. We can, of course, ask questions about the rainbow similar to those we asked about the tree, but an additional nuance now arises. Does our lack of ability to touch, smell, taste, or hear a rainbow make it any less real? What do we mean when we say that something is real? In the case of the rainbow, we can use physical principles to explain its emergence from light scattering and dispersion through water in the sky. The explanatory power of such physical principles has given us the capacity to predict, to mimic, and even enhance natural phenomena beyond our existing sensorium. However, the ability to explain and predict, while certainly a quality we have grown accustomed to expecting from an ordered universe, is not sufficient to describe its reality. From a practical standpoint, we explain and predict at the level of the phenomena observed. For trees in daily human life, our existing senses are sufficient to establish the nature and consequences of their reality. As the seasons change, so the trees cycle and grow and live and die. But in general, for rainbows and other less concrete phenomena, we expect a true description of reality or realities to exhibit some brand of internal coherence and oneness, even if it is limited in some domain of applicability. Instead of touch or feeling, we substitute words like sensing or influencing to describe the physical link that mediates an observable effect. Feeling the rough bark of a tree emerges as an effect caused by the repulsion of negative charges in the bark and in our hands. But we as humans experience the roughness, not the charge distributions. Likewise, seeing a rainbow involves the transmission of dispersed light to our eyes, but the underlying laws governing these two distinct phenomena were unified under the equations of electromagnetism. We move from the more concrete to the more abstract, and as perception becomes less direct, we must rely ultimately on tools of thought that are invisible, even though they may be correlated to certain physical observables. This is the realm where thought weds fact, as James Clerk Maxwell pondered. What defines the fact and its measurable and immeasurable qualities is precisely the problem before us. So as a third physical example, consider an electron. This is a commonly drawn representation for molecules. You may also be familiar with the molecule or the electron atom picture in your high school textbooks with an electron orbiting the nucleus. And these pictures at a quantum level are highly misleading because, as in the orbiting electron, this would be catastrophically unstable for a charged particle. This common ball and stick model that you see here is also misleading, though for different reasons. Quantum scientists now understand from many experiments repeated over decades that electrons exhibit both particulate and wave-like properties, depending on their context and whether they are being observed. The careful listener will immediately raise a series of objections. Aren't trees that we can feel with our hands made of atoms? And don't those tree atoms have electrons which allow us to feel the trees? How can the stuff of solid reality, the trees, be made of invisible bits that are describable as ephemeral waves? Is the stuff of matter really so capricious? If there is order and law to matter, as physicists insist and believe, then why are the governing principles behind the appearances so finicky, subject to choice and context? Indeed, these are good objections, but there are even other ones, perhaps more foundational to our purposes here. If I imagine a tree or rainbow in my mind, what reality is associated with that form of apperception, if at all? If two of us agree we see a tree or rainbow and experienced it together as such, does that make it more real than if I see it alone? To what realm do we attribute the observational subjective, the individual consciousness that does the observing, the choosing, and the questioning? What I am alluding to is about much more than scientific methods. It is about the nature of a whole system of co-observing subjectives, in other words, life, with different observational capacities, making different types of observations, hypotheses, theories, and paradigm shifts in communities to construct scientific models of physical reality, philosophical frameworks for perceived relationships, and value systems based on their collective representations. These collective representations are based on mutually agreed upon apperceptions. They exist in the realm of thought, and they obey laws dictating relationships between quantities that should, in some cases, correspond to physical observables. So, one of the main lessons quantum physics has reinforced scientifically and philosophically is the distinction between either or and both and thought. Dualities, like those described for the electron, which can be both wave and particle, depending on how you look, abound in multiple areas, and they are not always grounded in the natural world. We have subjectivity and objectivity, spiritual and physical, mind and matter, potentia and manifestation. Each set of dualities comprises a spectrum, not a strict binary. And along each contour of that spectrum lie possibilities for truth and falsity. This makes life richly complex, but also at times treacherous, because there are great possibilities, but also grave dangers. For example, that which is subjective, personalized to the individual, can be true or false, just like that which is objective, a mutually agreed upon measurement, can be true or false. Subjectivity should not be misequated with falsehood, and objectivity should not be given a carte blanche pass as always true. Measuring devices are always limited by some degree of experimental precision and accuracy, and they can, of course, give wrong or misleading results if not used properly. To complicate matters, there exist dualities in what we know, the known versus the unknown, and our ability to know, the knowable versus the unknowable. There are symbols, pointers, metaphors, maps, and models that we use to describe reality, but reality is never exactly what we think. Even our myths, our legends, and our stories, they enable and guide us through the complexity of existence. So this brings us to a critical juncture in this talk, where we must make the distinction between cumulative knowledge and individual awareness. Words that have been used in the past to describe presumably non-overlapping domains, for example, the natural and supernatural worlds shown here, may be better understood when put in context through a third domain, the supranatural world. And I'm indebted to my conversations with Paul Harding for giving the language for this talk, which describes a knowable realm that lies beyond the present awareness of an individual subjective or an individual community of subjectives. Such a world, like the supernatural, is knowable, but vast tracts of the landscape are unknown. And the tools that we use to explain and predict in the natural world are not the only ones that can be used to advance the boundary with the natural. Indeed, as Einstein wrote, the most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It is the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and true science. What constitutes the mysterious, of course, is dependent upon the individual subjectives under consideration, because the boundary between the known and the unknown is subjectively defined by each knower or community of knowers. Alan Lightman comments on this experience at the boundary. The boundary between the known and unknown is not a static boundary. It moves as we acquire new knowledge and understanding. The boundary constantly shifts. The other side is the mysterious. That other side intrigues us. It stimulates us. It provokes us. It haunts us. And it produces new science and new art. The decreasing thickness of the lines shown here as pointers is not coincidental. A conventional sense of the natural world is one that perceives a solid and stable reality, even though what lies beneath is constantly in flux and behaves when unobserved, unlike anything remotely resembling solidity. The thickness of the lines thus corresponds to the strength of a perceived solidity, but in reality, such perceptual differences are illusory. The scientific fixation on observational capacities in the natural world has led us inexorably to the bedrock conclusion that the physical world is no more solid than the unknown but knowable supranatural world. Even within the physical world, there are unknowable elements which are quantified in their unknowability by the Heisenberg uncertainty relations. The supernatural world, which likely cannot be reduced to a mathematicized description akin to physical law, is posited here as a world of knowable order, superseding the natural world where thought, emotion, will, passion, soul, and spirit are conceived and interrelate. Indeed, the supernatural world need not be unknowable. That is merely a central assumption of modern materialist philosophy, which insists that physical things are all that can exist. Its corollary, positivism, then negates the existence of the subjective self accordingly. The confusion lies in misassociating ultimate reality, what lies behind the appearances, for what is simply conventional, known, and familiar, common sense reality, to put it plainly. However, what is known is not more real than what is unknown, just as a country you have never visited is not more real after you travel there. It is just more known, in other words, familiar to you. Your inner subjective has discovered something new, but truly you have merely rediscovered what other subjectives already knew. The mystery of interlocuting, analogizing, and discovering for oneself the unknown is a process ultimately without method. It is a qualitative leap of faith. There are guiding principles, and humility of one's own knowledge and awareness is an essential starting point. For a prerequisite to genuine discovery is a deep commitment to uncovering and recovering the insights of subjectives who have come before us, or who co-discover with us. Such prior and cumulative knowledge is necessary but insufficient, for at some point the demands of life will test one's commitment to discovering truth. So as Pilate asked the King of Kings, what is truth? It is important to distinguish here between capital T truth and everyday truths of common existence, which upon deeper reflection are realized to contain elements of capital T truth, no matter where, when, and in what context we observe. This distinction reflects the same difference between ultimate reality and the common sense realities experienced on the ground of daily life. In fact, the challenge for scientists is to remain sensitive to the boundary with the collective unknown. And this is shown here as the wavy curve, the supernatural curve. I did say this was going to be a sketch, and this is my sketch. So even as various hypotheses, theories, or contemplations, the term Aristotle used in psychology to designate the moment of fully conscious participation in which the soul's potential knowledge becomes actual or awakened. And these paradigm shifts, hypotheses, and theories, they take place within the bounds of the finite, our known world, finite but long with respect to a human life. The crucial issue is another duality. A full description of the natural world would be infinitely complex. So we resort to explainable models which describe that complexity in simpler terms, but our knowledge of nature remains finite. There is and there will remain an irremediable gap between what we know, our scientific models, our philosophical frameworks, our logics, our creations, and the truth. Jorge Luis Borges, in his one-paragraph short story, Del rigor en la ciencia, describes an empire where cartographers make a map so large, detailed, and exact that only the scale of the actual landscape will suffice. The tattered fragments of such a cumbersome map naturally are discarded by succeeding generations. Is this where science is headed? The supernatural is not synonymous with a God of the gaps framework, where all ignorance is qualified with being beyond the limits of the natural world. Quite the contrary, in fact, because capital T truth or little t truth and falsehood exist in every world and are always defined relative to a standard. However, the methods to discern capital T or little t truth differ in each realm, and so the standards used can be different. Belief that one has captured the totality of capital T truth by the perceived achievement of a standard of truths in a particular realm is falsehood. Ultimately, following truth always leads to more truths about the nature of truth. The danger that some scientists have fallen into is equating their limited models with the truth, or making them coextensive with the truth, flattening the infinite richness, complexity, and mystery that lies behind the appearances. Rather than seeing their limited models in all modesty as merely personal contributions in stepping toward the truth, they have reified their models as all that can be. You can hear resonances of this hubris in statements regarding the standard model, grand unified theories, or a theory of everything, which Stephen Hawking recanted on his deathbed. These statements reflect an underlying worldview, one in which these scientists have made their necessarily finite maps equivalent with the infinitely complex terrain itself. I am not denying that some scientific maps are more in correspondence with or have more efficacy in predicting observables in the physical universe than others, but I am cautioning against reading any scientific map as ever reaching a singular point of finality where any subjective observer is done with discovery. A map may be good enough for a given purpose, and that's why we use it, but the universe is always ready to teach us something new. In short, truth is reality, but truth is difficult to approach, to get behind the appearances, to see behind the veil, as it were. As John Koenig neologizes in the Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows, our oculism, the awareness of how fundamentally limited our senses are, makes us wish we could experience the whole of reality instead of only ever catching a tiny glimpse, to just once step back from the keyhole and finally open the door. Truth is more mysterious and capacious than what any one subjective can possibly observe, than what a whole community of subjectives, or even all humanity from all epochs of time can observe. Truth is infinite, infinitely rich and complex, capable of leading a subjective observer deeper and deeper into the very ground of reality, existence, and being. For example, observations of the sun's behavior from Earth gradually led to a heliocentric model of the solar system. This model eventually gave way to a theory of gravity in which the Earth and sun both orbit around the barycenter of the solar system, not specifically around the sun, but very close to it due to its enormous relative size. A similar transition with missteps, false starts, incremental gains, and massive shifts occurred in the evolution from classical to quantum mechanics and from Newtonian physics to relativity. Such evolutions remind us that our prior maps are not wholly without value. Indeed, they are accurate within their domains of applicability, but they are also false in a strict sense that they cannot describe new observations that fall outside those domains. This is the human condition. We are limited by our mental maps of reality. If we constrain reality to our finite maps, we limit the possibilities for truth to be discovered, and we restrict human flourishing, becoming instead bound like the reductionist models we idolize. When we consider carefully the observational capacity of the measuring subjective, a world of possibility is opened up. But this is usually swept under the rug of so-called scientific treatments. For example, if the subjective is completely blind, then the question of using visible light discernible by eye to corroborate a measurement is moot. The blind subjective cannot corroborate that aspect of the physical object, but the individual can imagine the existence of such a feature through analogy, comparison, and translation with their other senses. If the subjective is dyslexic, illiterate, or innumerate, this would also change the types of effective communication that could occur to arrive at a realistic picture of the cosmos. Anyone who has ever code switched in their life knows this to be true, because statements about the supernatural and supernatural worlds often lack the precise mathematization of physical theories. They are often discounted by scientists. But there is little doubt that there exists truth value in non-mathematicized and even ineffable statements. Statements about supernatural truths, little t truths about capital T truth, in particular, can be as equally progressively revealed in time as those about natural truths. These timescales, again, can be very long with respect to a single human lifespan, but they are finite. For these reasons, perhaps, Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, reminded us that the crowd is untruth and unfit to determine one's personalized relation to capital T truth. Just as each observational subjective has personal strengths, privileges, and abilities, each subjective also has limits, burdens, and weaknesses. The two dualistic poles are inextricably paired in each subjective. Increased observational capacity in one arena can thus, in certain cases, even debilitate or impair observational capacity in another. Choice enters the game when the subjective must decide which strengths to develop and which weaknesses to ignore. Martin Buber, the Jewish philosopher, in his slim meditative volume, I and Thou, poignantly captured how even the choice of how to relate to another person or thing is conditioned by one's self-concept. Before we conceptualize the I of the self, we interact, we relate, and we connect with others and with things as thou. Once the moment of relation has passed, these persons and things re-enter the world of it as mere objects, strictly concepts. But in order to create dynamic relationship, such concepts must re-enter the world of thou through intimate connection in a mutually illuminating circle. If relations never re-engage at the level of I, thou, and remain strictly I, it, so rises the potential for exploitation and what the Martinican poet Aimé Césaire called thingification, a dehumanizing attempt to transform all relations into commodities. So modern science gives us new tools to probe that which we don't know, the supernatural, but can separate us from the wholeness of direct subjective experience. So how do communities of subjectives produce knowledge? They make observations in community. So there are general observations common to the human experience with the five senses or a subset of those, and within prescribed bounds of normality. They're verifiable in mass by populations of subjectives. But because subjectives don't share common tools, they're prone to vast areas of disagreement. So again, the richness and the dangers of common life present themselves. Now there are scientific observations, and these are also made by communities of subjectives. And these observations generally require lots of time, resources, and specialized knowledge to perform and interpret. And the more uncommon the observation, the fewer subjectives can verify it because of cost and knowledge to interpret. Generally speaking, scientific observations augment our existing sensorium using tools and devices. So we can see deeper into matter, or we can see farther with telescopes. And so the question is, this elite or select group of individuals that we call scientists, have they become the priests of nature? I'm using this word or phrase to describe what Rob Iliffe used to describe Isaac Newton, who actually wrote more about the biblical books of Daniel and Revelation than he ever did about physics. But are these priests of nature? What are the tools that they use, and how are they interpreting the results of their data, including myself as a scientist? And keep in mind also that these observations are not limited to human subjectives. If you've ever seen a squirrel attacking a bird feeder, you can see very clearly that subjective consciousnesses solve problems in that way. So important thing to keep in mind are the terms of observation. Subjectives must agree on those terms in order for observations to be meaningful. So in science, this manifests as what to measure, how to measure, when to measure, where to measure, in protocols. And the results or data that emerge from these observations become connections between those two subjectives or more. Densely connected networks of subjectives produce scientific theories or facts, at least in the world of science, but this also holds true outside of science. The question is, where is the line between science and generality, general observations and those that are deemed scientific? The boundary between who is included in a particular observing process depends on the value and the quality that we ascribe to different data sets. So immediate questions arise. What is high quality? What is careful and rigorous? Who defines what is valuable when there is disagreement? And what is objectivity? In fact, specialized protocols are highly conditional and therefore limited in their domains of applicability. And only sometimes are these stated explicitly, especially in the popular press. So a strict reductionism would mean knowing more and more and more about increasingly less and less, such that eventually we're never able to communicate. And if you've ever been to a scientific conference or maybe a theological one, you'll find this to be the case, even for closely related domains of science. So here I show you a Simon Raper's history of influence in philosophy, but the same could be true for any discipline. And what we see here is these nodes in the network that become so densely connected that they exhibit an extraordinary influence over others. And we'll talk about this actually more in my second lecture today, but you'll see that even Hegel demands more attention than Aristotle. And even more intriguingly, this is an entirely Eurocentric framework for philosophy and for our frameworks. So how do these dualities that we have in our thought systems manifest in our language? The spirit that is described in Genesis 1:2 begets the word in Genesis 1:3. So there's a connection between the realm of thought and the realm of language. Aristotle's treatise on the soul, Parapsyches in Greek and De Anima in Latin, highlights in its title the very heart of the matter. Psyche in the Greek could be used for life as well as for soul, pointing to the union of the natural and that which lies beyond it. The nous of which Aristotle spoke, clearly distinguished from mere sense perception or reason, loses its broader sensibility in Aquinas's Latin translation intellectus, the modern intellect. Nous meant much more, the faculty of the human mind that is necessary for understanding what is true or real. The role of nous in perception extended beyond merely feeling, sensing, and influencing to all levels of increasing abstractness or potentia. By adopting the more rigid frame of, say, a Descartes or Bacon, movement in the noetic sphere is discounted or diminished. Though essential by their construction, what presages the Industrial Revolution in Europe is prioritization of the movement of physical bodies in Newtonian space. The same pattern in history reasserts itself. Diminution of a larger truth establishes a sense of control and mastery over the truths one understands clearly, but the consequences of ignoring the larger truth are still being felt to the present day. It's intriguing that quantum physics should lead Western science back to the psyche. The Greek letter most commonly attached by quantum scientists to a wave function is in fact psi. The fundamental role played by the observer, or even the observational conscious awareness in the act of choosing, selecting, and performing a quantum measurement enforces a strong departure from the classical Newtonian picture, where infinitely precise, simultaneous measurements of observables for any physical object can be made along all points of its trajectory. While a useful approximation for the orbits of celestial bodies and the mechanics of other continuum extended objects, this picture breaks down in molecular and atomic systems. So the wave function is a calculational tool. It's dependent on the observer, and it quantifies that observer's history of interactions with a quantum object. But it becomes a collectively defined mathematical representation when two or more observers agree on that representation. It has no ontological reality, certainly no more than any other description. So this is the only slide that you'll see today that has equations on it, but it highlights again that distinction between Newtonian physics on the left and quantum physics on the right. This is Newton's second law at the top on the left and Schrodinger's equation on the right. And so I've summarized here some differences between the two equations. But one thing I want to highlight is, though it's commonly called probabilistic, the Schrodinger equation is linear, but there is a crucial nonlinear component to the measurement process. And that measurement process, the interaction of an observer or a measuring device with a subsystem, is a process that is inherently nonlinear. And that nonlinearity, the fact of a circle of interaction where the environment acts on the system and the system has a back reaction on the environment. That is essential to a quantum paradigm. So there are many interpretations of quantum mechanics that I don't have time to go into here. The most popular being the Copenhagen, but there are some that take seriously the ontological value of the wave function in a many worlds interpretation. And there are even some that point to a set of variables that deterministically drive what's happening in the measurement process, but they are hidden from our perception. And then these two, cubism and a relational view of quantum mechanics, help us to see that quantum point of view, that distinct observers may give different accounts of the same sequence of events, thus forcing us in those interpretations to relinquish universal objectivity. So the result of all of this is that we inhabit a relational and participatory cosmos, where name and form, pet names and intimacies, symbol and meaning, metaphor, and interaction and interconnectivity are essential. So networks of subjectives produce knowledge, but how can they promote wisdom? Martin Luther King Jr. in his 1963 classic Strength to Love riffs off the philosopher Arthur Balfour in saying, "We now know too much about matter to be materialists. Materialism is a weak flame that is blown out by the breath of mature thinking." The ancient Hebrews gave us a strong sense of the significance of the observational inner subjective in their description of the unspeakable divine name Yahweh. Without an exact sequence of vowels provided in the Tetragrammaton, the name of God would necessarily take on a unique form within the personalized breath of each individual speaker. Sigmund Freud, highlighting the Egyptian training of Judaism's most renowned prophet in Moses and monotheism, argues that the supreme triumph of monotheism, emerging out of this Mediterranean civilization, is the compulsion to worship an invisible God. It is the prohibition against making an image of God that signified subordinating sense perception to an abstract idea. It was a victory of spirituality over empiricism, but contrary to the fears of the new atheists, one in the service of intellectuality, an inwardness that seeks to improve rather than stultify people's capacity for thought. An individual able to contemplate the unseen but formative dynamics of inner life is poised to better know thyself, and as a result to better observe and understand outer life in the cosmos. In like fashion, a renewed vision for science must extinguish the curse of modern materialism, which the medieval mind did not generally fathom. That by equating our scientific models of physical reality with the whole of reality and ultimate truth, we have limited the observations we include in these models and therefore limited the richness of scientific possibility describable therein. This cardinal sin of materialist science, flattening truth by equating it to a scientific model, is what I call pseudolatry. We see this in Romans 1, where those who worship the created are limited by those same models that they worship. Human logic systems can themselves be shown undecidable and incomplete. And in the interest of time, I won't go into all the details, but starting from Aristotle and Nagarjuna, popularizing the notion of the principle of non-contradiction, which encodes the excluded middle that the 20th century mathematician David Hilbert identified as his most important tool, saying, taking the principle of the excluded middle from the mathematician is the same thing as prohibiting the boxer the use of his fists. But instead of mathematical combat, perhaps there are other paradigms. In fact, Aristotle's Buddhist counterpart, Nagarjuna, envisioned other possibilities for logic, alluding to claims that are neither true nor false, and both true and false. The most widely studied logical paradox of statements that are both true and false is highlighted in the biblical New Testament in Titus chapter 1, known as the Epimenides paradox, quoted there as all Cretans are liars. It can be rephrased as all human beings are liars. If I'm a human being, the self-referential statement points to a larger truth beyond the language of the claim. One can deal with this larger truth by refining that claim. But even mathematically, the development of non-binary logics is an active field of research. Instead of a classical bit that can take on merely 2 values, there are also new logical possibilities for systems of 5 fundamental values instead of 2, including true, false, true and false, neither true nor false, and perhaps ineffable. Big science and big religion have both made the mistake of flattening the infinite distance from truth, such that the scientific models or philosophical frameworks about the truth are inflated as the truth. So what is truth? There's some dangers that I will summarize before we conclude. There's dangers for the experiences, observations, and frameworks that lie outside what seminarians and the spiritual think about truth, because what we think about truth is certainly not the whole of truth. There's also a more perilous situation when those same individuals ignore science, which then excludes the possibility to interpret events that are taking place in the physical world with real human consequences. We have seen this play out during the pandemic. At worst, this double danger results in making our philosophy and theology mere navel-gazing, and thus irrelevant to others who are seeking substantive, meaningful truths to improve their lives. For scientists, the gravest danger is to ignore completely the philosophical frame in which they operate, believing that our models of physical reality are coextensive with the ultimate truth. And even the most revered scientists can fall prey to this danger. Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen described in their famous 1935 article some of the difficulties with quantum entanglement, but their definition of physical reality is instructive. While they were referring to a specific mathematical association between observables and quantum operators, asserting the physical reality of something only by what we can predict with certainty is a common but unfortunate pitfall in Western science. For all of us and for life in the relational cosmos, we are deeply impoverished when we exclude legitimate observations from the development of our scientific models and philosophical frameworks. There are consequences when our mental maps are so restricted and narrow for human societies and the living ecosystems that we inhabit and are called to steward. We would be better served by the oculism I described earlier, a sense of how fundamentally limited our senses, our models, and our frameworks are. So in my next lecture today, that I hope you can join us for, I'll make this connection more concrete in both a practical and a historical sense, as we explore implications of science in a world shaped by materialism, racism, and colonialism, and where our knowledge systems are informed by the privileging of certain narratives and subjectives over others. Thank you so much for making time for this important discussion, and I look forward to hearing the response and the questions that come. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Nolasco for introducing us, and also to Dr. Kurian for his presentation. Since we planned for a brief 10 to 15 minute response, I will jump right in. So I offer my reflection as a Christian theologian, so please bear with me and correct me if I'm off chart here for science. So anchoring Dr. Kurian's renewed vision of science is the idea of, quote, interconnectivity of inner subjectivities in a relational cosmos. And this resonates with several core commitments of Christian theology. There are many ways to enter the conversation here from a Christian theological perspective, but I want to highlight one significant point of connection, and this is the question of interpretation and how we understand the world as text and each other that Dr. Kurian terms as a form of a mental map that include not only reason, but also sensing, influencing, and feeling. Whether it's science or religion, deeply indebted to European Enlightenment, we have understood the question of truth with a big T to signal something singular, the sum of all parts that comes to a totality of singularity of truth with a big T. However, singular truth claims present fidelity to experience and tradition accepted as a universal norm, while discrediting claims made by others. In other words, exclusive claims to truth with a big T often come with claims to exclusive canons. Claims to truth involve a process of interpretation, of course, as one of translation, producing erasures and foreclosures, while also opening other possibilities. Truth claims can also be self-serving and camouflage partiality, imperialist universality, exclusivity, and disavowal of other claims to truth. Novelist Chimamanda Adichie refers to this tendency to unknowingly and knowingly construct as the danger of a single story. And I would say further that it is the conceit, or perhaps even a ruse, of false singular universality that enlightenment modernity has sort of parsed out to the rest of the world. Philosopher Hans Gadamer notes in his seminal text, Truth and Method, hermeneutic or interpretation is about decentering the subject, recognizing, of course, many multiplicity of subjectivities, not as I and other relationship, but perhaps even an I and I relation. And truth claims, engaging in a dialogue of back and forth with an open awareness of limits to our knowing and our knowledge production. So we approach interpretation with humility, wonder, awe, curiosity, and recognition that text, people, traditions, interpreters, and interpretations are rather than impartial, always partial, comes with prejudices and particularity and context. Dismissing this is to dismiss the ways our narrow interpretations create structures and systems that validate one-dimensional perceptions as truth, big T, and of course, universal. And education continues to shape our thinking through the Enlightenment model, significantly tethered to dualities that Dr. Kurian mentioned. And I would include in those dualities male, female, colonizer, colonized, dark, light, West, and the rest of the world, civilized, primitive, human, animal, spirit, matter, and many other forms of dualistic thinking that foremost continues to overprivilege reason and intellect, and of course, particular kinds of reason and intellect as the height of knowing and knowledge production. Some of our prejudices come to structure our thinking even before we encounter others, other worlds, other traditions and texts, and shape our reach toward a desired and capacious understanding of truths, because dualistic frames of thinking and interpreting rely on the denial of intersubjectivity, interdependence, and multiplicity of relations that constitute every interpreter and interpretation. Dualism, as one of several core epistemological frames, is deeply constitutive of Western modernity and its ways of being in the world. Of course, such a worldview believes itself to know what, and this prejudice forecloses other possibilities and mysteries. In Western Enlightenment epistemologies are those haunted by the spectrality of truths prematurely and often forcibly, violently foreclosed and erased. The call to, quote, relinquish a universal objectivity, end quote, is one that many post-colonial and decolonial thinkers and practitioners have been arguing for. Decolonial thinkers examine other archives to how truth is felt, experienced, and rationalized. Decolonialism examines the permeation of these Enlightenment logics as they were the logics undergirding much of colonial projects around the world, and continues to shape how we think of ourselves, others, and the world. And I would imagine that this day and age, in the context of globalization and neo-imperialisms and colonizations, that we are not, even as we claim to be liberated, I'm sure that we in some way are still continually shaped in our thinking through these Enlightenment logics. So by turning to archives of wisdom from what we can loosely term here as the global South, we encounter scholars who are not only critiquing, say, dualistic models, but bringing forth other indigenous cosmologies and philosophies. For example, to ways of being an interpreter and doing interpretation that accounts beyond the narrow reliance on reason alone, a Western version of reason alone. These quote unquote cosmovisions evidence reason and intellect tempered by multiplicity of ways we claim truth and wisdom. incarnating through a network of relations that define our existence. Relationality and community come into the interpretive process of knowledge. Here, I want to suggest a different understanding of the process of interpretation that seems to align with what Dr. Kurian presented. A philosopher of science, Bruno Latour, notes, quote, multiplicity of engagements, of strategic assemblies of humans and non-humans, is the only way to cope with what the multiple loops traced by the instruments of science reveal of the narrative complexity and entanglement of planetary sociality, or what I call the planetary sociality. With each interaction, the manifold of entangled relations is reconfigured. What we thought was a singularity of truth is actually multiple. It is provisional, it is contextual. There are no singular causes and there are no individual agents of change. Subjects in this paradigm understand that our ongoing responsiveness to the entanglements of the self and others, here and there, now and then, are always contingent and ongoing. In this intra-entanglement, we are accountable then to only who are part of this recognized entanglement, but also our enactments of exclusion. This points to the depth of our intimacy with the multiplicity of universe around us. Each subjectivity is singular, but also not singular. With each, we each become and have our distinctions, but in this deeply relational cosmos, each relation, each caress or flight of relation reconfigures the world in its becoming. As a physicist philosopher, Karen Barad notes, quote, there is sedimented into our becoming, become us, quote, end quote. As I mentioned, in the process of making claims to universal truth claims, we have often foreclosed others. And in fact, our claims are haunted by those foreclosed others and their claims because, whether acknowledged or not, these others are sedimented into our becoming. Rather than a shrunken world, a relational view resonates with a desire for an expanded and indeed an expansive world. The force, movement, intensities of a relational understanding of self and the world lead us to what moves us, the gravitational pull of what Gadamer noted as a fusion of horizons, what Whitehead referred to as a lure. Such an affective lure reminds me of Paul's letter to the Corinthians, chapter 13, verse 8. Knowledge will come to an end. Love never ends. But this love that remains, that does not end, is not without reason or intellect. And here I want to bring in a philosopher, Boaventura de Sousa Santos, in his book, The End of the Cognitive Empire, who argues for epistemologies that are not indebted or tethered to Western modern Enlightenment humanism alone, but search in the archives of the global South and to indigenous cosmovision of the Andean region anchored in the concept of corazonar. As he notes, corazonar is, quote unquote, warming up of reason, end quote. As emergence of becoming, a corazonar is a hybrid of emotions, affects, and reason. It is, quote, act of building bridges between emotions and reason. It is an affective way of knowing that is not in contradiction to reason. The heart guides the reason then, whether to enjoy or change the world, a world made up of humans and non-humans. Corazonar is an expanded way of being with, for it increases reciprocity and communion, end quote. This corazonar is like Sylvia Wynter's notion of praxis of being that creates what she terms a third reality, a reaching with and toward meeting the other, the universe halfway. So I want to end my brief comment by suggesting that at its earliest formation, emergence, and interpretation, Christian faith and its praxis of being have been grounded in this commitment to relationality, multiplicity, remarkably evidenced in its core theological interpretations of the incarnation, the word become flesh, our understanding of the Trinity, and the corazonar of radical inclusion. In these, there was and is a deep awareness of how transcendence and immanence, human divine matter and spirit, past and future, self and others, are never discrete, but always manifesting in, through, and with multiplicity of relations, irrefutably constituting our existence and challenging us to meet the other and thus the universe halfway. So I end here with part of a poem by Alice Fulton titled Cascade Experiment on the danger of single claims to truth with a big T. Because truths, we don't suspect, have a hard time making themselves felt, as when 13 species of whiptail lizards composed entirely of females stay undiscovered due to bias against such things existing. So we have to meet the universe halfway. So I want to just end my response here, and I'm open to further conversation. There's so much that Dr. Kurian offered in his presentation that I think really aligns and creates space for more conversation, particularly on the process of interpretation, translation, and decentering certain universal claims, particularly coming out of the European Enlightenment and its modernity. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe.
Kurian, do you want to respond to Dr. Joe? And just a reminder to our participants, please use the Q&A option for your questions. Dr. Kurian.
Sure. No, I actually had a question for Dr. Joe.
Go ahead.
To start with, can you explain? I had some trouble hearing like what the Korazoner. I don't know how to pronounce it, but can you say more about that a little bit?
So it's from this book. The End of the Cognitive Empire, the Coming of Age of Epistemologies of the South. Okay. And what De Sousa Santos is really arguing for is decolonizing or sort of academic epistemologies that tend to be really indebted and tethered to the Western modernity, particularly coming out of the Western Enlightenment project that is overdetermined by reliance on a particular kind of reason, rationale, and of course, science, right? So Korazoner, it comes from, I think, the root word Korazon, the heart. So it's really tempering this sort of claims to objective scientific ways of knowing the truth, to say that there are other epistemologies, there are other ways that reason never exists in itself, but that reason is always often, of course, in relation to other ways of knowing truth, right? Through our senses that you mentioned, right? Feelings, vibrations, intensities, movements, and what have you. And so I think, I drew on him because, this is a book that I taught last semester as well, and begin to think about, what does it mean to decolonize, how we know what we know. I myself am a product of education within the US, right? So there's a lot of ways in which there's a conceit of certain referentiality that seems like it's not there. It makes itself invisible, but it's actually very much, if you name it, it's very particular. It's a European Enlightenment modernities project, right? And so I think, many of us, even in science, it seems to me, we are searching into other archives, right? Other traditions, other philosophies to gain not just knowledge, but I think the difference between knowledge and wisdom, right? Wisdom about the world that we inhabit.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joe. Later today, I'll reference some insights that came from a lecture that we hosted in my lab in February by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who I'm sure you're both aware of. But if you're not, we'll talk about decolonizing the cognitive process. So this is such a great reference. Thank you for that.